I am the Inquisitor. Welcome.
In the 5th episode of the TV show Star Wars Rebels, a new villain is introduced who calls himself the Inquisitor. Portrayed brilliantly by Jason Isaacs, this character immediately became the main villain of the show until the end of Season 1, where he,
There are some things far more frightening than death.
At the time, the point of the character was pretty obvious. The show wanted a consistent lightsaber-wielding threat for the characters to face, so that we could have intermittent lightsaber duels in our episodes, and because the only established lightsaber-wielding villain in the original trilogy was Vader, they had to come up with something else. Although they did just give up in Season 2 and bring in Vader anyway. But the Inquisitor offered something to the show that Vader never could, a consistent, original villain that could be defeated by the heroes if the writers wanted him to. And with the death of the Inquisitor at the end of Season 1 and the promise of Vader in Season 2, fans of Star Wars Rebels were expecting us to move on to bigger and better things in future seasons. But after a brief detour with Vader in Season 2, 2 more Inquisitors were introduced, and it became clear that the creators of the show wanted to do a lot more with this idea than we had initially thought. It was here in Season 2 that we got introduced to the idea that the Inquisitors were actually an entire order, more than just a single guy. These 2 unintimidating goofballs are the 7th sister and 5th brother, respectively. And though I think Rebels Season 2 takes a tumble in terms of creating stakes and an intimidating villain with these guys, it does present an important precedent. What was originally known as simply the Inquisitor is now the Grand Inquisitor, the leader of an organization dedicated to hunting down Jedi survivors after Order 66. And through a variety of Star Wars expanded media, we have been introduced to a great many more of these Inquisitors. I've made it no secret in the past that I don't really approve of Disney's Star Wars content as a whole. Most of it lacks a lot of creative verve, and the additions they made haven't really added anything substantial to the canon. And with an ever-expanding landfill of Disney Plus shows at your disposal, it becomes more and more difficult to keep up with Star Wars as time goes on.
Like a panther. Yes?
But for once, I'd like to actually say something positive about Disney Star Wars, and highlight an aspect of the lore that they added to the canon that I actually think is worth looking into. Specifically because I think a lot of people don't understand how deep the concept goes, as well as how important the Inquisitors have become to the new Disney canon, in terms of being a clever way of connecting a lot of projects that wouldn't otherwise have a lot of overlap. In addition, I truly believe the Inquisitors were a good addition to the existing canon of Order 66 and how it functions. But perhaps one of the greatest flaws behind why people don't understand this is because of how confusing it can be to keep track of the Inquisitors' appearances. And it's clear that a lot of the depth they added to this concept later on wasn't really intended from the start. For example, if you watch Star Wars Rebels, the first appearance of the Inquisitors, you'll get a sense of who the Inquisitors are and how they function, and that there's more than one of them in the Order. But you might not get a sense of the greater details present within the concept that are explored in other media. After the finale of Season 2, the Inquisitors disappear from the show and are barely even mentioned again, with the latter half of the show focusing on other Imperial threats that don't relate to the Inquisitors. But this was only to be the beginning of the Inquisitors' lifetime within Disney Star Wars. It's important at this point to mention that I actually haven't read and watched every single appearance of the Inquisitors in the Disney canon. Although I have viewed my fair share of the Disney Plus TV shows, there are comics, books, and other shows that I have not read or watched. One notable example would be the book Inquisitor: Rise of the Red Blade, which came out in 2023. This seems to go into a lot more detail about the Inquisitors and how they function, and although I haven't read it, it does speak to how prevalent the Inquisitors have become and continue to be in Star Wars lore even to this day. With the Grand Inquisitor debuting in 2015, we are steadily approaching an entire decade's worth of Inquisitor-related content in Star Wars, and I think it's genuinely interesting to track the evolution of the Inquisitors through the various media they've appeared in. And aside from the comics, which have been carrying Inquisitor-related stories and references for a while now, the next notable appearance of the Inquisitors outside of Rebels was probably in the Ahsoka Novel by E.K. Johnston. This book was published in late 2016, and it's actually one that I remember quite enjoying as a kid. The Inquisitor that appears in the book is known as the Sixth Brother, and is sent to the remote Outer Rim world of Rada to track down Ahsoka Tano, who is in hiding. The book actually explains how Ahsoka gets her double white lightsabers that we see in the Rebels TV show later. In the book, she faces down against the Sixth Brother, and uses the Force to destroy his lightsaber, killing him in the process. She then uses the destroyed lightsaber to form her white lightsabers by purifying the red kyber crystals within them. Interestingly enough, a similar story was depicted in one of the episodes of the later released show Tales of the Jedi, although the events in it aren't exactly the same as the book, so I'm not actually sure which version of this is canon anymore. It is possible that the 2016 Ahsoka novel is no longer canon, which is unfortunate because I believe the novel tells a better story than the short Tales of the Jedi episode. But either way, a precedent was beginning to be formed, as early as 1 year after the debut of the Grand Inquisitor in Star Wars Rebels. The next very notable appearance of the Inquisitors happened in the video game Jedi Fallen Order, released in 2019. In this game, you fight two Inquisitors, the Second Sister, the main antagonist, and a secondary antagonist known as the Ninth Sister. The Second Sister is revealed to be a fallen Jedi, a former Padawan of your mentor Seer in the game. This was an expansion to the lore that we really hadn't heard much of, except one mention in Season 2 of Rebels, where a vision of the Grand Inquisitor reveals that he used to be a Jedi Temple Guardian. The actual details of how the Inquisitors came to be had been pretty sparse up until that point, but now we're starting to get a clearer picture of where they come from. All the Inquisitors have been revealed since then to be fallen Jedi that were turned to the dark side and trained by Darth Vader to hunt down others like them. In Jedi Fallen Order, the Second Sister reveals that turning these Jedi to the dark side and into Inquisitors often involved intense torture, inflicted over long periods of time, until the Jedi finally relented and turned to the dark side, in order to serve the Emperor in hunting down Jedi fugitives after the purge we saw at the end of Revenge of the Sith. This paints the Inquisitors in somewhat of a tragic light, reframing them more as victims of the purge just like any other Jedi. It's hard to imagine these straightforward, cookie-cutter bad guys of the Seventh Sister and Fifth Brother in Star Wars Rebels having tragic backstories, but it may only be a matter of time before we see these backstories in some amount of Star Wars media. Another addition that Jedi Fallen Order made to the concept of the Inquisitorius was their fortress. Located partially underwater in the aquatic world of Nur, the Fortress Inquisitorius houses many of the Inquisitors and acts as a base of operations for their dealings throughout the galaxy. The fortress later appeared in the 2022 show ObiWan Kenobi, where Obi-Wan has to travel to the Fortress Inquisitorius to rescue Princess Leia. In this show, we also get a few more details about the fortress, including a trophy room where we see a lot of captured Jedi that have been killed and preserved. In addition, we get to see a few more Inquisitors, along with reappearances from the Grand Inquisitor and the Fifth Brother. We also get introduced to the Third Sister, who serves as a primary antagonist in the show, and the Fourth Sister, who is more of a background character in this show, but later has more to do in the Tales of the Empire show that released recently. The Obi-Wan show expands more on the Third Sister's backstory, as she was a Padawan that was involved in the Temple Purge that happened in Revenge of the Sith. She barely escaped and was eventually converted into an Inquisitor. But unlike the Second Sister in Jedi Fallen Order, she has an ulterior motive of assassinating Vader, in revenge for what he did to her Jedi brethren during the Purge. Expanding on what we saw from the Second Sister in Jedi Fallen Order, this show presents us with the idea that the conditioning the Inquisitors go through is not infallible, and some Inquisitors actually can present the capacity for change, or for overcoming that conditioning. At the end of the show, the Third Sister leaves off on a somewhat positive note, having abandoned her fight with Obi-Wan and leaving the Empire to, assumedly, find her own path. No longer are Inquisitors just faceless, nameless bad guys in service of the Empire. They have character, and they have the capacity to redeem themselves. The next time an Inquisitor was shown in Star Wars was in the Ahsoka show, which premiered in 2023, in which we're introduced to Moroc, a rogue Inquisitor that somehow survived the end of the Empire and continued on to become a mercenary during the Age of the New Republic. There isn't a whole lot to say about this character. He doesn't speak a word in the entire show and seems to only exist as a minor villain for Ahsoka to defeat easily, but I think what's more interesting about Moroc is that he represents the idea that some Inquisitors actually ended up surviving even many years after their usefulness had long since expired. It's strange in the sense that up until this point we were led to believe that the Inquisitors were dissolved after the Purge. But Moroc apparently survived all the way past Return of the Jedi, long after most of the Jedi were extinguished and the Inquisition was dissolved. As far as I know, this character has not appeared in anything else, save a brief cameo in Tales of the Empire, and the wiki page is very vague about what he is or where he comes from, so we can only really guess at what he was doing before the events of the show. The mere existence of an Inquisitor this long after the Jedi Purge presents a lot of new storytelling opportunities for these characters, and I'm excited to see if this gets expanded upon in future Star Wars content. And finally, the most recent appearance of the Inquisitors as of the release of this video is Tales of the Empire, a short mini-series in which we get to see, among other things, the birth of Barriss Offee as an Inquisitor. Weirdly enough, fans had actually speculated that Barriss had become an Inquisitor for a long time prior, ever since the release of Rebels Season 2, when many people mistakenly identified the Seventh Sister as Barriss. It's pretty clear that this was never actually the intention of Dave Filoni or the creators of Rebels, but it can also be inferred that Tales of the Empire was made as a direct response to that fan theory, because it is definitively now canon that Barriss Offee was an Inquisitor, though not the same one as the Seventh Sister, and the show follows Barriss as she becomes an Inquisitor and eventually rejects being an Inquisitor, turning back to the light side and helping other individuals escape the Empire. This acts as a good follow-up to Barriss's arc in the Clone Wars TV show, and also gives us more information about the Fourth Sister, who turns out to have somewhat of a personal relationship with Barriss, eventually leaving off on a somewhat ambiguous note, where she may turn to the light side, but maybe not. The show kinda ends on a cliffhanger, so we're not really sure at this point. Again, this show adds more to the idea that the Inquisitors are somewhat sympathetic, tragic villains who are turned to the dark side by force, and who have the capacity to change back to the light. Barriss's story in this show is presented as tragic, where she joins the Empire because she feels betrayed by the Jedi Order, and then eventually learns that she made the wrong decision and seeks to correct it, only leading to her potentially losing her life. So, where does this leave us? Well, it's hard to deny that the hype and excitement surrounding Star Wars has diminished in recent years. With Disney continuing to churn out more and more Star Wars related content, so much of which ends up being very middle of the road. Less and less people seem interested anymore. And if you take the incredible amount of time needed to watch all of this content, it's really not difficult to see why. But at least somewhere within this tangled mess, there exists an idea that I believe was genuinely a good addition to the universe as a whole. The Inquisitors bring so much interesting depth and storytelling potential to the time of the Empire and the original trilogy, having evolved far beyond their initial purpose as generic side villains and becoming characters in their own right, providing us with insight not only into the inner workings of the Empire, but also into what happened to many of the Jedi survivors after Order 66. And for what it's worth, I really do genuinely find the Inquisitors interesting, and am always excited to see them appear in some sort of new Star Wars medium, even if their weird helicopter lightsabers are stupid and I hate them!